Hello, this is Mike, and welcome to another episode of Urban Legends and Mythology. On this episode, we are finally doing a deep dive into spiritualism. It's a subject I've been talking about off and on for the last few episodes, and I've decided to finally just dive into some of the details about it, what it is, where it came from, how it still exists in today's world, and I might even get into a little bit of its philosophy. And usually with these, I always start at the beginning, but this time I'm going to start with a brief definition and overall general idea of what spiritualism is. And I'm ripping this right out of Wikipedia, so feel free to follow along. So, spiritualism is a social and religious movement which was popular in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And it's really based on the foundation that a person's spirit or their general awareness exists after death, and that this spirit in the afterlife has the ability to contact the living from the spirit world. And at the same time, humans using various devices, techniques, psychic phenomena, etc., are capable of contacting their deceased loved ones, for example, in the spirit world. And this is due to the fact that even though our physical world and the spirit realm are completely independent from each other, they are in constant interaction with each other. Now, according to spiritualist philosophy, this is the realm where all the dead go, and the evil entities and the good entities. The lowest level is hell, the highest level is heaven. So it's kind of almost like that same idea that we get from Dante and his works. But overall, the main tenets are there is an afterlife, there is a spirit world, and we can communicate with the spirits in this spirit world. That's kind of like the core central understanding of the whole thing. Of course, then you get the point where you expand off that, and a lot of spiritualist beliefs developed here in America and Western Europe, so they were viewed through the lens of Christianity. So it takes on a lot of this Christian lore. Essentially, the spiritualists believe that these spirits are capable of advising the living on moral and ethical issues and the nature of God. And these spirits are supposed to guide you into how to be a better person, how to make better life choices, how to gain a closer relationship with God in order to, I guess, have a better afterlife. Now, according to spiritualist beliefs, anyone can receive spirit messages, but formal communication sessions, i.e. seances, those are usually led by mediums. In the movement, they're called discarnate humans. And these psychic mediums, discarnate humans, are supposed to be more in tune with the psychic world. They have special gifts that make them more open and receptive to the psychic communication between them and the afterlife. And they're supposed to be your best source, for lack of a better term, basically being your telephone, your line to the afterlife. Now, the thing with spiritualism is it doesn't have like a set defined doctrine or a set of rules. It's kind of all over the place, because instead of being a religion defined by texts or tradition, this is more of an informal movement. And every sect has its own little defined set of rules. And a lot of these sects, they didn't see it as religion at all. They saw it as science. They saw it as a hard science, because there would be evidence presented to the observer or the participant, and they would take this as hard proof and scientific fact. And spiritualism from the beginning was scrutinized by scientists all over America and Europe. And for a lot of people, this just really reaffirmed and reinforced their religious views, because most religions have an idea of an afterlife, and they saw the use of, for example, these instruments, which they consider to be scientific instruments, as a way to scientifically prove that there is a spirit world. And naturally, that idea would take off in such a culture. But where it really starts is here in the United States in the 1840s. And it really appears in western New York in what's known as the Burned Over District. They call it this because even in the 1840s, this was still kind of the frontier. It was very rural, it wasn't very heavily populated, and there was kind of a lack of formal priests and preachers in this area, so there was this religious revivalism going on. It was part of the Second Great Awakening. And the Second Great Awakening was this Protestant religious revival which was going on, and it sparks all these different religious movements. And without going into too many details, it kind of sparks religious groups like the Mormons, the Seventh-day Adventists, the Shakers, the Quakers, and of course the Spiritualists. They were all kind of these nonconformist, almost folk religious type groups. And they're all related to these reform movements such as abolition of slavery, women's rights, utopian social experiments, anti-Masonry, prohibition, and even vegetarianism. Now, it wasn't all concentrated in Western New York, it was all over the frontier, but Western New York is where we really see the birth of spiritualism. And it starts on March 31st, 1848. Now, it can be argued that spiritualist practice go back even further, even to people like Mesmer, but this is the date where a lot of modern spiritualists cite the beginning of their movement. And it starts in Hydesville, New York with the Fott sisters. Now, the Fott sisters were Leah, Margaret, and Kate. Now, they were originally from Ontario, however, they had settled in Hydesville, New York in 1847, and their house was reputed to have been haunted. There was just kind of a rumor going around the village that that's the haunted house where some guy was murdered. Now, the two younger sisters, Kate and Margaret, while they were lying in bed one night, they were hearing these rapping sounds like... And they convinced their older sister, Leah, that this was the ghost of the guy who died in the house who was communicating with them. Now, in fact, what happened was this was these young girls. They were cracking their toe knuckles against the bed frame and making these noises as a prank. However, it's immediately believed that these girls were in contact with a spirit, and word spreads, and the two young girls become local celebrities. And the older girl, Leah, she kind of becomes like their manager, their agent, or whatever you want to call it. So what happens is these friends of the family who are like radical Quakers, they hear about this and they take the girls into their home, and it's about a month later, it's about April, May of 1848, and they reproduce the same kind of rapping noises. They quickly become convinced of the same story, that these girls are communicating with these spirits, and they introduce these two now mediums into their circle of radical Quaker friends. And this pretty much starts off that original core group of spiritualists that would emerge into this giant movement. And all of a sudden, spiritualism takes off. These girls become the first two kind of celebrity mediums, to the point where they're doing tours. P.T. Barnum actually hires them on for a while. And from the beginning, spiritualism becomes linked with these kind of progressive reform movements. A lot of radical Quakers were abolitionists, and they were kind of disenfranchised with how mainstream churches were just kind of not interested in the abolition of slavery. A lot of these early folks were people who advocated for women's rights. Some of them were even socialists who were interested in going even further into the frontier and creating their own kind of visions of utopia. But women really do come to the forefront of spiritualism. It really does become the domain of the woman. Anytime you go to a psychic medium, it's usually a female performing the seance or leading the way. Of course, it's generally accepted within spiritualist circles that it's because women are more receptive and open to, I guess, communication with the afterlife. And that's probably true, but personally, I think it has something to do with this early revivalist movement amongst these religious groups who really emphasized women's rights. And a lot of these early trance lecturers and spiritual mediums who would travel out in the country in the wake of the Fott sisters' fame, they were all kind of in that same vein. They advocated for women's rights, they advocated for abolition, they advocated for a more equal and progressive society. And very early on, we start to see the emergence of the classic seance, of automatic writing, of spirit boards, and all the tradecraft you see being employed by these, quote, psychic mediums. And very quickly you start to see the dark side of that, because people realize they can make a buck off of this. So you see this explosion of psychic mediums popping up on every street corner. And many of them were charlatans who were just playing common parlor tricks in order to gain a buck. And very quickly, even by the 1850s, it starts to sour the movement because people are skeptical. So as early as 1850, even in places like France and England, you had scientific inquiry into these seances, and they were debunking stuff left and right from the frauds out there. Now, they didn't just go out to straight up debunk these people, but they wanted to look at it from a scientific perspective, so they wanted to observe these seances, observe these things like planchette moving, automatic writing, and try to recreate it in a laboratory setting. And what they found out was that a lot of this stuff could be recreated very easily. So you start to see this interesting dichotomy. On the one hand, you have all these people that truly believe in what they're doing because they're viewing it through a religious lens. And on the other hand, you have people latching onto this idea, using parlor tricks and magic tricks just to make a quick buck off of anybody who's willing to step up to that seance table. And then you have other groups emerging. You have groups of people who may believe in spiritualism, but they're kind of out there to debunk the frauds because they've either been defrauded or they see it as souring the movement. And you have that group of people who are just zealots and they believe everything they're shown and they're blind to the fact that they're being defrauded and tricked. However, the spiritualist movement at this time was flourishing, and by the time we hit the Civil War, we see it explode in popularity for that first time, especially amongst New Englanders. So as I discussed back in my introductory level on this topic, how the Civil War influenced spiritualism and modern death practices, the war created a massive loss of life amongst the American populace. Almost 3% of the American population died as a result of this war. And we have to remember, for context, in the 1860s, the world population was only 1.1 billion, and the American population was only about 31 million. So losing almost 3% of your population is kind of a huge deal. But more importantly, the war sparks this death industry, this obsession with death. And in the New England mind in particular, where these movements had really taken hold, that idea of the good death becomes a thing, which gives rise to the modern funeral industry, and it fuels spiritualism. Because now these people, they kind of want that spiritual connection with their lost loved one. And this is the 1860s. They don't know if their son had died a brutal death on that battlefield. They don't know if he had a good proper burial. They don't know if they'll retrieve the body or if he'll just be lost and forgotten on some battlefield somewhere. So in order to gain a sense of closure, a lot of them would turn to spiritualist practices, most importantly, the seance. And of course, there was a group of people out there willing to take advantage of that for a buck. And then later in the war, when it's found out that Mary Todd Lincoln is holding seances in the Red Room of the White House in order to contact her son Willie, who had died of illness, it kind of spreads like wildfire because it's like, well, if the First Lady is doing it, that's fashionable. I want to be like the First Lady. However, we do see the idea and the practice of spiritualism take a sharp decline in the South for a number of reasons. For one, it never really took off in the South the way it did kind of in New England. They didn't really have that same kind of spiritualist revival movement going on that happened in places like Western New York. They remained largely kind of Baptist and Protestant or whatever. That was part of it. Spiritualism being tied to radical movements like abolitionism and women's rights and socialism didn't really play well to Southern audiences. And then the absolute devastation of the war, and when I say devastation, I mean entire swaths of the South were depopulated for a while. It kind of fueled a more nihilistic outlook of the world, at least amongst that first generation or so afterwards. So it was much slower to catch on in the post-antebellum South. To be honest, what really catches on in the South isn't spiritualism per se, but it's this idea of ghosts. Mostly people who died during the war who aren't able to move on because they have some kind of unfinished business. And to be honest, I think the popularity of ghosts haunting places, especially in the South, is less to do with spiritualism and more to do with that romanticized view of what was lost when the antebellum South was destroyed. But I digress. Now, what happens to spiritualism post the Civil War is it kind of starts to taper down as we focus more on westward expansion. During the Gilded Age, we have kind of this new generation of people who didn't see the horrors of that war, and spiritualism kind of starts to taper off. It becomes more niche. It never really goes away, but it kind of falls out of popularity. It becomes kind of the thing of carnival sideshows and traveling circuses. It becomes associated with stuff like the palm reading parlor down the street. And I would argue by around the beginning of the Gilded Age, it's really ended that first wave of popularity as national focuses shift towards other things. But it never truly does go away. There is still real interest in it. And then in the 1890s, towards the end of the Victorian era, interest in it starts to kick off again in Europe, mostly places like France and England and Germany. And this is to do with a cultural movement at the time where it's kind of a backlash against that Victorian prudism. We start to see a bunch of these esoteric kind of societies growing. There's kind of a reemergence of interest in things like magic and some Eastern philosophies. And there's a general reemergence in the idea of creating Masonic type fraternal societies. The most famous of these being the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. You might have heard of it by now. Most famously joined by and then destroyed by Aleister Crowley. And the people in these organizations, they really took a shine to stuff like spiritualism. Arthur Conan Doyle, who was a member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, was famously a total zealot when it comes to spiritualism during what becomes the second wave. Now, the second wave of spiritualism really does come out of the First World War. And we all know the Great War, the First World War. It was one of the most brutal wars in history, and its impact still affects the world to this day. I mean, look how fucked up the Middle East is. A lot of that has to do with World War I. But it was a brutal, senseless war that caused a lot of unnecessary pain and suffering and death. And all that brutal pain and suffering and death, along with these grieving families at home, they flock towards spiritualism. Because spiritualism is kind of advertised as that way you can speak to your loved one last time. And it led to a massive upsurge of fraudulent mediums this time around. Meanwhile, real spiritualists are just like forming churches and kind of doing their own thing, while a million other so-called psychic mediums emerge in order to basically make money off of a grieving population, further souring the movement. And to be honest, it gets so bad that it pretty much collapses in the 1920s, and we really don't see an emergence of anything like this again until maybe the 1960s. The massive influx of frauds kind of set back the whole movement about 40 years. I mean, we don't even see a massive resurgence of it during World War II. But of course it doesn't all go away, because the baby boomers, the hippies of the 60s, they end up latching onto kind of these Eastern spiritual beliefs, all these beliefs that are coming out of India and Asia. And then once again, there's kind of this reemergence of spiritual practices, and it kicks off the New Age movement. Now, to be honest, the New Age movement is mostly associated with Asian practices that Americans have kind of amalgamated and perverted in our own weird American way. But some of these people do start to kind of rediscover spiritualism. Of course, by the time we get to it today, it's nothing like the original movement, which was loosely associated with Quaker religion. It becomes bastardized by our pop culture. It shows up as a trope in horror films. It gets wrapped up in this dark magic occult stuff. It gets wrapped up in the satanic panic of these And then it kind of gets spun into things like modern witchcraft and goth culture, while the religious aspect of it is completely forgotten. However, not totally forgotten, because let's ask ourselves, what happened to that original religious mindset, those ones that stayed away from all the parlor tricks and charlatanism? Well, that evolved. There are churches out there, and this is worldwide. They're spiritualist churches. And the oldest and I think largest one is here in America. It's under the banner of National Spiritualist Association of Churches. It was formed in September of 1893 in Chicago at a convention, and the reason it was formed was to promote the truths of the religion, both spiritually and practically. And this organization was partly formed in a response to all the frauds out there. They believed that they could help non-spiritualists determine the difference between real spiritual mediums and the frauds. And they do in practice everything a church does. They have their own kind of doctrine. Now, in America, it's very independent and loosely defined. And most of these churches adhere to this Declaration of Principles, which was first written in 1899. And these principles are things like, we believe in infinite intelligence. We believe that the phenomena of nature, both physical and spiritual, are the expression of the infinite intelligence. We believe the highest morality is contained in the golden rule. Everybody knows what the golden rule is. And it goes on from there. I'm not going to recite all 9 of them. If you want to look it up, you can look it up yourself. But there's a strong influence of Unitarianism there, which makes sense because one of the early founders was a Unitarian. While it's influenced by a lot of this Second Revival, Protestant Reformation type stuff, they're kind of on the fringe of Christianity. They don't necessarily denounce it, but I don't think a lot of them are holding Jesus up as their central Lord and Savior. They seem to be less focused on religious doctrine and more focused on this balancing act between science and religion and philosophy, and how the spirit world and the physical world kind of interact with each other. All in all, it's a very interesting religion that, to be honest, I didn't even really know about until very recently when I started researching this project, I don't know, 6 months ago. And I can see why it's attractive to a lot of people. But then again, the idea of an afterlife is very attractive to humans. That's why the idea of an afterlife exists in almost every religion on this planet. Because let's face it, at the end of the day, in the great scheme of things, humans, we only live for, if we're lucky, 100 years. Most humans tend to die in their 70s, so let's say 75 years. And in the great scheme of things, that's less than the blink of an eye. So that idea that in this vast universe that has existed for over 13 billion years, that we only exist for 75 of those years, yeah, that thought is scary. So of course belief in an afterlife is going to take off. I guess it gives us a sense of hope when we realize that the end is inevitable and it's not just going to be non-existence and darkness. But that's really all I have on the subject of spiritualism today, and to be honest, this is the last recording session of this big, long series of episodes on spiritualism I've been doing, and I am finally glad to be done with it. Now, that being said, this won't be the last episode you hear on the subject because I do record these out of order, and there is at least one more episode coming up on the subject after this, which I recorded a few weeks ago. But this is all for a purpose. For those who have been following this season, you're starting to notice there's a bit of a theme going on here. And it's all foundational work leading up to my 100th episode, which will air this season, and the season finale. And in order to make those episodes go smoothly and not have to dive down a whole bunch of rabbit holes during those recording sessions, I decided to create a bunch of these foundational ones to give a sense of context. You guys will get it as the season progresses if you haven't already gotten it now. But to be honest, there are going to be a few episodes I throw in to kind of break up the theme. I mean, I have one on lizard people I've been waiting to release for a while, and that's slated for this season. So watch out for that one. It's coming. And a few other subjects. We're going to do some classic Cold War conspiracy theories, including 2 episodes that have been requested since day 1. But that's all for the future. As of right now, this is Mike. I thank you for listening. Make sure you're following it on Spotify. That really helps me out. Make sure you're following it on the socials. That helps me out as well. Go ahead and check out some of those reels I'm doing on Instagram Reels. They're really fun. They're not really done to a schedule. It's just whenever I randomly feel like doing one. Also, check out the Threads page. I post some stuff on there as well. And if you want, you can always listen to this on YouTube as well. I don't really do anything with it because it doesn't really generate anything for me. But if you prefer some kind of imagery, even if it's a static image, go ahead and check it out. As always, you can support the show monetarily by clicking on that link in the description of every episode. It's totally not sketchy at all. It actually helps out the show a lot. And if you don't want to do any of that, you can always just tell a friend. Word of mouth is the fastest way that this show grows. And it's easy for me because I don't have to advertise anything. And on that note, I will see you in the next one.